The day Sergeant First Class Yara Okonkwo arrived at Fort Bragg, it was raining in that particular North Carolina. Rain falls in late October. Not hard enough to cancel anything, just hard enough to make everything miserable. She had driven 11 hours from her mother's place, outside of Windsor, Ontario, crossing at the Ambassador Bridge with 2 duffels and a rifle case in the back of a borrowed Jeep, because that was the kind of thing she did. She did not ask for rides. She did not ask for much of anything. The men in her new unit noticed her before she noticed them noticing her. That was always how it worked. Staff Sergeant Okonkwo, Ranger qualified, 2 combat deployments, 11 years in. She had her record in a folder and her orders in her jacket pocket. And neither of those things would matter for the next several weeks. Not really, because the men in Bravo Company had already decided who she was before she cleared the gate. The first one to say something out loud was a soldier named Taggart. He was the kind of man who mistook confidence for competence and had gotten away with it long enough to stop distinguishing between the two. He leaned over to the man beside him, a quieter type, UN, who would later have the decency to look embarrassed about this, and said, just loud enough, "Command's really doing this?" Okonkwo heard him. She always heard them. She had been hearing some version of that sentence for 11 years. She set her gear down, checked the bunk assignment on the board, and did not look at Taggart once. Her father had been with the Canadian Forces before she was born, a signals operator who'd done a stint in Cyprus under UN blue helmets and come back with a bad knee and an extremely specific opinion about the importance of preparation over improvisation. He raised her in Amherstburg, just south of Windsor, in a small house with a garden that got too much shade and a basement where he kept his old kit, cleaned and folded and stored with a care that bordered on liturgical. He taught her to shoot at 13 out at his friend's property in Essex County with a .22 that had a stiff bolt action and a scope that sat slightly left of true. She had to compensate for the scope from her first shot. That was the first lesson, and her father did not tell her about it in advance. He just handed her the rifle and let her figure it out. She hit the can on her 3rd try. He nodded, which from him was significant. She joined the U.S. Army at 22 after her citizenship came through. Her mother was American from Flint, Michigan, which made the paperwork manageable, if not exactly easy. She went through basic at Fort Jackson, passed selection for Ranger School on her first attempt, and graduated in a class of 31, where she was the 3rd woman to complete the course. She did not make a speech about it. She called her father, who was watching the hockey game and who muted it to talk to her, which she understood meant more to him than the call probably seemed to warrant. She was not by nature someone who needed to be understood. The assignment to Fort Bragg was temporary, attached to a sniper certification program that had opened its advanced track to personnel from across multiple units as part of a pilot integration effort. The program was run by a lieutenant colonel named Prentice, a man in his late 50s who had spent most of his career doing things that were not in his official record and who had very specific ideas about what a sniper was and who a sniper could be. He made those ideas clear on the first morning, standing in front of 12 candidates in a briefing room that smelled like old coffee and cleaning solution. He did not raise his voice. He rarely did. He was the kind of man who had learned that volume was for people who needed to be sure they were being listened to, and he had not needed to be sure of that in a very long time. "This course will eliminate most of you," he said. "Not because most of you aren't good soldiers, but because most of you don't have the specific cognitive profile this work requires. It is not about physical strength. It is not about toughness. It is about something harder to define and considerably harder to teach." He paused, and his eyes moved across the room in the way of a man taking inventory. "Patience," he said, "not the waiting kind, the thinking kind." He looked at Okonkwo for slightly longer than he looked at the others. She did not look away. He moved on. After the briefing, walking out to the range, Taggart fell into step beside a man named Sobieski and said something in a low voice that made Sobieski shake his head, not in disagreement, but in the particular way of a man who thinks the risk of being overheard outweighs his personal enthusiasm for the topic. Okonkwo was 6 feet ahead of them. She heard every word anyway. The word Taggart used was not a word she repeated, not because it bothered her more than it once had, but because she had made a decision years ago about which things she would spend energy on, and repeating words like that cost energy she'd rather put elsewhere. The first week was classroom work, and she was fine, better than fine. She had studied ballistics the way some people study languages, obsessively, privately, building fluency through repetition, until the concepts stopped feeling like concepts and started feeling like grammar, the underlying structure through which everything else was parsed. She understood the mathematics of it, but more than that, she understood the feel of it, the way variables interacted, not in isolation, but in sequence, each one downstream of the last. Prentice noticed. He said nothing about it. The second week moved to the field, and this was where the program separated people quickly. Stalking exercises, moving through terrain without detection, getting into a firing position, while an instructor with binoculars tried to pick you out before you could take your shot. This was the part that broke the candidates who were good shots, but impatient thinkers. This was the part Okonkwo had been thinking about since before she arrived. She moved differently than the others. It was hard to describe without sounding mystical about it, and she had no patience for mystical descriptions of things that were, in fact, technical. What she did was slow her thinking down to match her body, so that there was no gap between the pace of her movement and the pace of her mind. Most people, under pressure, moved their bodies slower than their instincts wanted and faster than their situation required. She had trained herself out of that mismatch. It had taken 3 years of deliberate practice, and it had not been enjoyable. On the fourth day of stalking exercises, she got within 200 meters of instructor Reyes, a lean, quiet man from El Paso who had been doing this long enough to find it genuinely interesting again, before he clocked her, and only because she'd had to detour around a patch of dry leaves that she couldn't cross silently from her approach angle. Reyes recorded her position and time. He said nothing. He wrote something down. At the end of the day's exercises, Prentice reviewed the results. He read out positions and times without names, and then he looked up. The one who got to 190, he said, needs to study the eastern approach to that ridge. There's a creek bed that runs parallel and damp all the way to the 150 mark. Use it. Nobody knew who he was talking to except Reyes, who looked at the ground, and Okonkwo, who filed the information away without letting her expression change. That evening, she walked the creek bed. Taggart started having a harder time in the second week. This happened to men like Taggart, the ones who were physically capable and procedurally competent, but who thought that stalking was a stealth problem when it was actually a patience problem. And it happened on a specific kind of schedule. They were fine until they weren't, and then they compensated by going faster, which made them worse, which made them angrier, which made everything collapse in a particular way. She did not feel anything particular about this. She had learned not to. The thing about working in a male-dominated environment for 11 years was that it did something to your internal accounting. You stopped calculating what you were owed and started calculating what you could actually spend. Not bitterly, not as a resignation, but practically, the way you'd adjust a budget when the baseline kept shifting. She had made those adjustments so many times, they were no longer adjustments. They were just the shape of things. What she did feel sometimes was a very quiet and very controlled anger that lived somewhere behind her sternum, and that she had learned to treat like a pilot light. Not something to extinguish, not something to let spread, just something to acknowledge was there, and to use, carefully, when the situation called for heat. Taggart dropped the stalking exercise on day 9. She did not watch him go. The composite scoring for the program was built on 3 elements: technical accuracy, tactical decision-making, and what Prentice called situational assessment, which was a formalized version of the ability to read a complex scenario and respond to what was actually happening, rather than what was expected to be happening. The scores were logged by Reyes and cross-referenced against Prentice's field notes, and the final composite was supposed to be a transparent calculation. On day 14, Okonkwo received her interim composite score. She looked at the number for a long time. Then she requested a meeting with Prentice. He made her wait 2 days. She used the 2 days to rebuild her stalking route from the eastern approach, which shaved 11 minutes off her time and brought her within 140 meters before Reyes could locate her. She noted the improvement. She noted that Reyes looked, briefly, like he wanted to say something complimentary, and then thought better of it. The meeting was in Prentice's office, which was small and spare in the way of offices belonging to men who spend most of their time outdoors. He sat behind his desk and she stood. He had not offered her a chair and she had not asked for one. "My interim composite," she said, "is 14 points lower than my raw performance average across all 3 elements." Prentice looked at her steadily. "Composite scoring incorporates additional evaluative criteria. I understand that, she said. I'd like to know specifically which criteria were applied and whether those criteria were documented at the time of observation or applied in retrospect. There was a silence. It was not a comfortable silence, but it was her silence as much as his, and she intended it to stay that way. Technique deviations, Prentice said. Your approach patterns show non-standard methodology. My approach patterns produce superior results by every measurable metric, she said. If the non-standard methodology is being penalized in isolation from its outcomes, I'd like that documented explicitly. She was not angry, or she was. The pilot light had its use, but what Prentice saw was not anger. What Prentice saw was a woman who had done her mathematics a long time before sitting down at this table and who was prepared to show her work. He said, I'll review the documentation. She said, I appreciate that. She left. She did not, on the way back to the barracks, allow herself to think about whether the review would go well or badly. That was not the variable within her control. Her approach to variables outside her control was to not spend time on them. 3 days later, Prentice told her, without preamble, that the documentation had been reviewed and her composite score was being recalculated. He did not say it in a way that invited discussion. He said it the way men who are not accustomed to admitting procedural errors say things. Flatly facing forward, with a tone that suggested the conversation was already over. She thanked him. She did not smile. Later, she would think about whether she should have felt triumphant about that moment, and she would conclude, as she usually did, that triumph was a feeling for people who had been surprised by the outcome. She had not been surprised. She had done the work, documented her case, presented it clearly, and waited. The outcome was what you got when you did those things. Triumph was for people who had been gambling. She had not been gambling. She had been working. The final exercise was scheduled for a Wednesday in late November. Cold morning, cloud cover, wind from the northwest at roughly 12 to 15 kilometers per hour, gusting to 20 in the lower corridor between the ridgeline and the target zone. Distance, 840 meters to a stationary target. 30 minutes to get into position. One shot. There were 4 candidates remaining. Okonkwo, a man named Breslaw who was quiet and technically precise, and who she respected in the uncomplicated way you respected sheet machinery that did what it was designed to do. A man named Osibonsu, who was talented but had a tendency to rush his breathing in cold conditions, and a woman named Trainer, who had surprised everyone, including probably herself, by making it to the final exercise, and who was working harder than anyone in the group. They went out in staggered intervals. Okonkwo was third. She had walked this terrain twice in the preceding 4 days. Not the specific route. Routes were assigned the morning of to prevent preparation of that kind, but the general topography, the drainage patterns, the way the light fell in that hour, the behavior of the grass in that corridor when the northwest wind moved through it. You couldn't prepare for the specific problem. You could prepare for every surrounding variable until the specific problem was the only thing left. She found her line within 11 minutes, position established in 22. That left 8 minutes, which was 8 minutes more than she needed. The wind was doing what she expected it to do. The target was exactly where it was supposed to be. The mathematics of the shot were not complicated. It was not a long shot by the standards of the discipline, and she had made harder ones in worse conditions on worse days. But the final exercise was not primarily about the shot. Everyone remaining could make the shot. The final exercise was about everything that happened before the shot and whether you could bring all of it to a point of sufficient stillness that the shot itself became almost incidental. She lay in position and waited. The wind moved the grass in the corridor below. A crow crossed from the ridgeline to a stand of pines to the south and settled in the upper branches. And she watched it settle because the crow was a data point. A crow that had settled was a crow that had decided the area was safe. And that decision was independent verification of her own assessment. She appreciated the crow for this. She breathed, she aligned. She understood, in the way that she always understood this moment, not intellectually but physically, in her hands and her eyes, and the specific steadiness that existed just behind her ribs. That she was ready. She took the shot. The impact was confirmed 43 seconds later by Reyes, who had been watching through a spotting scope from the elevated position to the northeast. He confirmed it in a flat voice, without inflection into his radio. Prentice, who was standing at the fire line with a stopwatch and a notepad, wrote something down. He did not look up immediately. When he did, his expression was the expression of a man recalibrating something. She had not broken his record. She had not been trying to break his record. She had been trying to complete the exercise correctly, and she had done that. At the debrief, Prentice ran through the results in the order they'd happened. He was precise and specific in the way of a man who had spent a career trying to extract signal from noise, and who had learned that imprecision in debrief was the fastest way to lose the lessons the day had produced. When he got to her result, he was quiet for a moment longer than the others. Staff Sergeant Okonkwo's approach in the final exercise, he said, demonstrates the methodology I have been trying to explain to candidates in this program for 6 years. She did not improvise under pressure. She had prepared for every variable available for preparation, and she was therefore free to respond to the remaining variable, the shot, with complete attention. He paused. That is what this program is for. He did not look at her when he said it. That was fine. He didn't need to. Trainer, who was sitting 2 seats to her left, caught her eye afterward, and Okonkwo gave her a small nod, and Trainer gave one back, and that was the entirety of the exchange, which was exactly as much as either of them needed it to be. She drove back to Windsor the following weekend, the same Jeep, the same bridge. Her mother made dinner, jerked chicken and rice peas, a recipe that belonged to her grandmother in Barbados, and that her mother had been making since before Okonkwo was born, and that tasted every time like something that existed outside of time. Her father came over for dinner. He was retired now, the bad knee worse than it used to be, and he moved around her mother's kitchen with the careful deliberateness of a man who had stopped pretending that things weren't harder than they'd once been. He asked her, over dinner, how it had gone. She told him. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, it was beginning to snow, the first real snow of the year, soft and without much wind, settling on the garden that got too much shade and the street beyond it. Good, he said, which was, from him, everything. She looked out the window at the snow and thought about the crow settling in the pines and about the creek bed running parallel to the ridge, damp all the way to the 150 mark, and about the specific quality of stillness that existed in the moment before a shot that had already been decided. She thought about Prentice, who was not a bad man. She had decided this somewhere around day 16, but who had carried assumptions so long he'd stopped knowing they were assumptions, and who had been, in the end, capable of revising them. That was not nothing. She had met enough people incapable of it to understand that the capacity for revision was, in a person in a position of authority, not a given. She thought about Trainer, who would probably be back next year for the advanced qualification, and who would almost certainly pass it. She did not think about Taggart. She had genuinely stopped. The snow kept falling, quiet and indifferent, and her father poured himself a small amount of whiskey and put the hockey game on, and her mother brought tea, and Okonkwo sat in the house she had grown up in, or close enough to it, and felt something that was not exactly peace and not exactly satisfaction, but was something in that neighborhood. Something that had been earned, not because anyone had given it to her, because she had done the work and the work had held. That was the part no one ever told you about beforehand. Not the winning, the way the work held,